Oh, I promised I was going to show you Dale's settings. All right, so let's do that again. Now, what I typically do when I do this is I don't do file export selected. And the reason I don't do that is because I want to make sure that I can verify the mesh before I send it out. So usually what I do is a two-step process where I create the mesh first, I verify it with cell open mesh, make sure that it doesn't have any naked edges. Make sure, because again, we've already established that I'm paranoid about making sure this stuff is good, and then we'll send it. So let's do that. So instead of file export selected, we're just going to run the mesh command. I'm just going to type mesh in the command line, and we get our old familiar friend here. All right. Now, what Dale told me to do, the very first thing we're going to do is zero out everything and do maximum distance edge to surface, which is set to what our file tolerance is. All right. So we're going to preview that and take a look. So we've got 437.06 polygons. And this actually is a pretty decent mesh if you look at this. But let's say that we feel that some of these areas are a little faceted and we want to crank this up a little bit. If we start messing with the initial grid quads, this will be how many quads the model gets broken up into before it starts triangulating. So we're going to bump this up. Let's start with about 200 and take a look at it. Keep an eye on a polygon count up here. We're at 437.06-ish. And right now this dropped. All right, so we're going in the wrong direction, which means we need to crank this up higher. So I'm going to try 500. And it's going to crunch for a second here. And so now we're back up to right about where we were before. So let's crank it up a little higher, because we said we were a little concerned about faceting in here, so let's crank it up just a hair more. Preview that. And we should get somewhere in the neighborhood of, you know, kind of 400 or 500 polygons, or 500,000-600,000 polygons, somewhere in there. All right, so we're at about 600,000 polygons. That, for a model of this size, is probably pretty decent. See how it's starting to kind of blacken up a little bit, but when we come in, it's not crazy. Let's take this to the extreme and say 2,000 and see what happens. And I'll show you what it looks like when it's a little overkill. If you're sending this to a Z-Core printer, which comes out looking like, you know, like yellow foam, you don't need to get quite as nutty as you do if you're sending this to a high-def SLA. If you're sending it to a high-def SLA, when those parts come out, those parts come out of the machine fairly shiny. They do have support structures and stuff that need to be busted off of them, but for the most part, they look really clean. So if you're sending a doll head sculpt, something like a Barbie-sized doll head sculpt that's got eyelids and, you know, wrinkles in the lips and things like that need to print, and they're going to go to a high-def printer, yeah, you're going to want to mesh the snot out of it. Most printers, and keep in mind here, all right, look what we did. We created 1.5 million polygons in here, right? That's a lot. That's probably too many. Most printers have kind of have a polygon limit. It used to be, when I first started doing this, you couldn't send a mesh any higher than 300,000 polygons. And so that's changed. There's, the high-def printers come up with, higher polygon counts, but it's important to kind of understand where this stuff is going. If you're going to send it to a Z-Core printer, 1 million polygons is dumb. All right, it's just a big file. It's going to make it slow to open. It's going to, on and on and on. If you're sending to a high-def SLA, okay, this might not be crazy. But before you do so, call them and say, hey, can you handle 1.5 million polygons? Because if they can't, then what's going to happen is you're going to send it to the Service Bureau. They're going to try and open it. It's going to say Polygon Count exceeded. And then they're going to have to open it in a third-party program like ZBrush or Freeform or Geomagic or something like that, and they're going to have to decimate it. Now, here's the problem. When somebody else gets their hands on your model and starts messing with it, you have no control over what happens to it. Your version of quality and their version of quality may be completely different. That's why I'm so obsessive about making sure that it's done, it's set up, and it's correct that nobody has to touch it. All they have to do is push print when they get it, because I don't want anybody else messing with it, especially freeform. Mattel is one of my largest clients, has freeform, lots and lots and lots of seats of freeform. And anytime they need to decimate something, it goes into freeform. And the problem with that is all they have to do is hit the smooth button once, and all of the detail on this thing is going to disappear. And it's a shiny big red button that's so tempting to push, and everybody does it, and it turns into, melted wax. So know where you're going. Know your service bureau. Talk to these people before you just throw this stuff over the wall. Trust me, the 2-minute phone call you make to say, what are we printing on? What's your polygon count? This is how big the thing is. What's a good recommendation? It'll save you. And the more you do this stuff, you'll kind of understand. Okay, it's going to go to a high def SLA. I need to be somewhere around 650, 700,000 polygons for something this size. All right. So there's a lot of kind of knowing who you're dealing with that will help you along the way here. So let's say 1 million polygons is too much for this thing. I'm going to say about 600,000 is probably where we need to be. So I'm going to back this back down to 750, and I'm going to say okay. A lot of it is trial and error when you're first getting started with this stuff. But what I keep an eye on is the polygon count when it generates. Created a mesh with 600,000 polygons. All right, 600,000 polygons. I know from experience that a 64 scale diecast car at 600,000 polygons is going to print great, right? So ideally, you don't want to make too few, but also ideally you don't want to make too many, because, like I said, then you're talking about the dreaded non-commissioned officer grabbing this thing and decimating it. Which, anytime you decimate it, all right, just the word decimation makes me scary. Makes me nervous, because it's you're throwing things away. So I always try and make sure that it's pretty much ready to roll. If you start getting numbers of 1 million polygons, or something like that for something small, you're going to be too high. So there's another note in here. What formula did you use to start with your initial number of quads in relation to the number of polygons? Well, seeing as we've broken this box down into only 2 settings, the very first thing that you're going to want to do is just set your maximum distance edge to surface. And I just set that to file tolerance. Don't set it under your file tolerance. Just set it right at your file tolerance. And then start cranking it up and see where it goes. When we zeroed this out, it actually made a fairly decent mesh. If you remember, it was, it's 54,000 polygons. That's not enough, all right? Because you can see it. So let's just go ahead and okay this, and you can see it. Watch. If I shade this thing, and I think I have to flat shade it. Oops, look at the right one. I'm like, wow, that looks really smooth. You'll notice, and actually this is rendering pretty well. You can start to see there's a little bit of faceting in the headlight, but this thing's tiny. Remember, this is tiny, so that's probably going to be okay. All right, a little bit of faceting in here. Maybe I need to crank that up. So let's do that. Let's crank it up a little bit. All right. So get rid of the mesh. So let's mesh this again. Meh. The meh command doesn't do anything. It just makes the computer indifferent. All right. So we're going to mesh this again. And we'll notice we've only got 54,000 polygons. So just start with something small like 200. All right, and then watch what happens to your polygon count. If it starts getting crazy, okay, 193, I could probably go a little higher than that. So let's go 300. 6, getting better. I'm pretty comfortable with that. The small stuff is starting to get, but maybe we'll go, I don't know. Let's go 450. Cause, as the kids say, YOLO. All right, so 395,000 polygons for something about this size is probably going to be decent. So if you're doing jewelry or die-cast doodads or things like that, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. All right, We can maybe crank this up a little bit more, but I think you get the point. So let's say, okay, so since we ran the mesh command, we just created a mesh. And the cool thing about this command is the poly surface that you use to generate it stays selected after the command is run. So all you have to do is hit the hide button, Control H. In my case, I have it set up as a hotkey. And it will hide your original poly surface and you can just look at your mesh. So what are we going to do? We're going to cell open mesh. No object added selection. This is a good thing. That's what we want. All right. We're going to cell bad, and it says there's a bad object there. So we're going to need to figure out what's going on. Let's look at naked edges. All right. It says found no naked edges, no non-manifold edges. The question is, why did cell bad happen? So let's check the mesh. And now check says this is a good mesh. Important things to consider. Has 313 normals that are not unit vectors. 3 over 13 which have 0 length. This doesn't necessarily mean the mesh is bad. They could cause problems. All right. So all right, so this is what cell bad was lining up on and saying, okay, there's pairs of faces that intersect each other. This doesn't necessarily mean the mesh is bad. It can cause problems if you're doing mesh booleans. We're okay with all of this. This is the information that we want to look at primarily. All right, it doesn't have any degenerate, doesn't have any extremely short edges, doesn't have any non-manifold. Most importantly, it doesn't have any naked edges, doesn't have any duplicate faces, doesn't have any faces with the directions different from the mesh as a whole, doesn't have any disjointed pieces, and doesn't have any unused vertices. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and buy off on that because the other things that cell bad was picking up on don't necessarily relate to printing. All right, so now at this point, the one other thing that I will point out, some printers used to not like quads. All right, and so just as a force of habit, I run triangulate mesh. And the reason that I do that is it just breaks up all those quads into nice little even triangles. All right. I don't remember off the top of my head which printer used to have problems with quads. I'm pretty comfortable that that has been fixed, but I just wanted to show you that feature. Okay. So at this point, now we can do file, export selected, make this test 2. We've already verified it, so I don't need to re-verify it, which is the reason that I do it this way. And as long as it goes out, file successfully written, desktop to STL. Now notice, when we sent this out, we made sure that it wouldn't export an open object, right? So by virtue of the fact that it exported successfully, we know that that object is not open, all right? And we should be good to go. So when you're printing, again, the pre-flight check is